Okay, so we have Elle and Yesenia are both like, and cameras off. You guys are a bunch of chickens. No, that's fine. Okay. So as I sort of mentioned, and I will continue to let people in, our goal for today is to kind of finish up. Okay, sorry, I'm not good at sharing my screen. Our goal for today is to finish up our conversation about all the speciation stuff, and then to, if there's any additional time, kind of talk about the opportunity session a little bit. And so, can you guys all see the PowerPoint? Is that cool?
Yeah.
It's very difficult for me when I'm trying to show my screen. Thanks for the thumbs up, Elle, because it's hard for me to look at the chat when I'm sharing my screen. So if you're putting stuff in the chat, I'm not going to notice it until I stop sharing my screen. So just say stuff. If you need anything, just, unmute yourself and say it. Okay. All right. So where were we with speciation? We had talked about the biological species concept and all these different reproductive barriers that support it. Right. And that was a fun time. Okay. And then, as I recall, where we left off was talking about how speciation can be either allopatric or sympatric. So who wants to tell me what that means?
I know, for real. All right, bye. I have diarrhea. Okay.
Jasmine, you're unmuted, just so you know. Do you want to tell us what allopatric and sympatric mean?
So allopatric was like the geographic separation that lead to like speciation.
Mm-hmm.
And sympathetic.
Since sympatric
was
the opposite.
Go ahead, is the well, I wouldn't say it's the opposite. It's just it's speciation that happens, but there is no geographic separation. So it's not really the opposite. It's just one has geographic separation, one does not. Okay. So it does not have really anything to do with geographic separation, is fundamentally the difference. Okay. So allopatric speciation, I think for most people, is like the easier one to kind of like wrap your brain around. Okay, for these reasons, right? So this is an example of, I got to make this a little bit smaller so that I can see everything here. So this is an example of speciation where we have these two species. This is the Grand Canyon, by the way. Two species of chipmunks, right? Aren't they adorable? I guess they're technically called ground squirrels, but they look like chipmunks to me. Whatever. Anyway, they look almost identical. They eat the same types of food. They live very similar lives, right? In all possible ways, they are very similar to each other. And yet, they are different species. So why are they considered different species? Well, they've been separated for a long enough period of time that differences have accumulated. Okay, so let's look at this slide for a second. So allopatric speciation, remember that's speciation due to geographic separation, right? Can happen by dispersal, or it can happen by vicariance, which in this case kind of means basically we're like splitting, and we're like literally there's a physical separation that emerges. Okay, so if you have a group that disperses, right, spreads to a different area, and that has geographic isolation, right? So I'm thinking about like, a land bridge forms and organisms go to this new space, and then when oceans rise again, the land bridge is gone, so now they're separate from the original population. Or if you've got some sort of seasonal flooding. So now a bunch of ponds that normally exist as separate ponds are all connected, right? And so, fish move to these new areas. And then as, the water dries out, now they're stuck in these new ponds and they're separated from their host population. So those would all be examples of allopatric speciation. Because what you're doing in all of those is you're separating by some sort of physical barrier, okay, some sort of geographic barrier. Is that okay? Does that make sense? Anybody having? I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger. Ooh, people are coming in. Oh, I got a thumbs up. Ooh, admit all. Let's get somehow I missed Maria. All right, Maria's coming in. Okay, beautiful. Beautiful. Okay. Hi, you guys. All right. So is that okay? Now, here's an important thing. And that is this step number 2, right? So there has to be, after the separation occurs, there has to be some sort of evolutionary force, right? Whether it's a mutation or whether it's genetic drift, right? Or whether it's natural selection, whatever it is, there has to be something that fundamentally changes the allele frequencies in that population. Or in some cases, it's not just changing allele frequency. It's like full on like changing, something fundamental about the DNA sequences, so that now over a period of time, these two populations, even if they became sympatric with one another again, right? So even if they reconnected spatially, right, they are now different enough that they're not able to like interbreed anymore. Okay, so that's allopatric speciation. So here's a little diagram of sort of like the different outcomes of this. So if you have allopatric separation, right, we've got our population, right, that's having gene flow, it's cool, right? We're sharing a gene pool, everything's great. And then there's some sort of barrier, right? So there's some sort of physical barrier. And so this little part of the population is over here by itself, okay? Over time, that population becomes different, right? And so the outcomes of this are these 3 different things that can happen. So one is there's a certain amount of difference, but that difference doesn't continue or escalate. So you end up with 2 separate stable populations that are significantly different enough that we are calling them most likely different species at this point. Fusion means that you have populations that are physically separated for some period of time or some distance, but then they ultimately come back together. In this example, has speciation occurred, you think?
Can you repeat the question?
I sure can. Right? So in this example, can you see where I'm mousing? Here, I'll use my fancy. Can I use my pen? Why is my pen not working? Hold, please. Wait. Ugh, you guys, technology is not my friend. Why can't I end show? Just a sec. Why is my pen not working? Does it only work there? Okay, let's try. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So in that example, do you see how there's this little image right here? It's like showing the beginning of the bigger image, but then our 2 populations are coming back together. So has speciation occurred in this example?
In that example, no, because they're just, and I'm pointing to it with my mouse, but I realize
I know,
you can't
but I
see
can't see
anything.
that. I know.
It diverges, it goes together eventually at the end, while the one above shows that it's branching off into 2 different things. The one in the middle, on the other hand, doesn't do that, but the top and the bottom ones do.
Right. So this middle one means that there was allopatric separation. There was geographic separation of some kind or another. but it didn't ultimately lead to speciation. The species, you know, the two populations that were separated ultimately didn't become different species. Okay. Whereas this reinforcement example and the stability example, the reinforcement, it's like they become more and more and more and more different. So this for sure leads to speciation. This may or may not. This might lead to populations that are slightly different, but ultimately not different species. So like maybe subspecies or something like that. Or it could mean speciation. So, right. So this is definitely speciation. I can write on a screen better than I can write with a mouse with my little pen. Fusion, no speciation. Right? And stability is maybe speciation. Okay. Does that make sense? Give me some thumbs up, y'all. Or unmute yourself and ask me a question, or put a question in the chat, but I can't see the chat, so don't do that. Oh, I see one thumb up. I see two. See a couple. Okay.
For fusion, does that mean that they weren't like separated for long enough?
It maybe, or it might just mean that there wasn't any selective pressure that was different between the two groups. So they could have been separated for a real long time, but if there's no selective pressure or microevolution hasn't occurred, or, you know, all the different things that we talked about that lead to, you know, changes in allele frequencies and populations, right? If none of those things happen, so there isn't a significant difference that builds up, then they wouldn't necessarily become separate species. So it could be time related, but it could just be like environmentally related, like, well, actually those areas aren't really, they're the same. So it, you know what I mean? There's no like difference. So a good example of that would be, somebody wrote in the chat. Ooh, Nikki put a thumbs up in the chat. So the difference there would be like, for example, we talked about how reindeer live in the northern part of all of the northern hemisphere continents, right? So in North America and in Asia, right? And they're definitely geographically separated, but at least my understanding is that they're still considered the same species because they aren't different really. And they could, if a land bridge formed between between Asia and, you know, Alaska, right where, you remember Sarah Palin, she could see Russia from her, anyway. If Alaska and Russia connected, there would go right back to being a continuous population. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I know my rambling doesn't work as well on Zoom as it does normally. Not that it normally works. Anyway, okay, so that is okay. So that is allopatric speciation, right? So the physical barrier could be all kinds of geographic separation. So it could be a river carving a canyon. It could be the uplift of a mountain range, right? Splitting a population. And then if we start talking about, it could be the, you know, movement of continents, right? It could be, if we're talking about aquatic animals, it could be series of floods or droughts that are making different bodies of water connect or separate, right? So while a land bridge would connect two terrestrial populations from one another, the result of a land bridge also could be that it separates two aquatic populations from each other, right? So I just want you to realize that it's not all canyons, right? That there's all different types of geographic separation. And quite frankly, there's all different scales. So we can appreciate how this little squirrel can't get to this little squirrel because look at all of that. That's not, squirrel can't be crawling down there and then crawling up there. That's a big area to traverse. But the barriers can be really seem very small and insignificant to us. right? Whereas they might be incredibly significant for the organisms that are experiencing that separation, right? So one of the things that I always think about when I think about this is like freeways. So it's if you're an animal, it's unless you're a bird, right? if you're not an animal who flies, if you are an animal that cannot fly, getting from one side of a freeway to another, potentially pretty difficult, especially if there aren't overpasses and whatnot, right? Because if you're trying to make a run for it, you know, your chances of getting squished are pretty high. Yeah. So while that's not a natural geographic barrier, it is still a geographic barrier. So yeah. Okay. Is that okay? Does that work? Okay. Because I know how much you guys love Galapagos finches. Right? The reason why there are so many different species of Galapagos finches is because of allopatric speciation. So the original population of finches on the Galapagos actually arrived there from Venezuela. So Venezuela is the closest sort of mainland area, right, to the Galapagos. And so there are finches that look something like that, that live on the mainland. And so likely what happened is there was a big windy storm and a bunch of birds basically got blown out onto these islands, right? And then while they're living on their islands, this habitat now, first of all, the Galapagos Islands are far enough away from Venezuela that it would not be, the finches they're not super powerful flyers, right? So they wouldn't be able to just like go back to the mainland like whenever they want, right? The only way they could get back and forth is because of like, you know, some sort of wind event. So they're isolated. So geographic isolation from the mainland. And then in addition to that, the individual islands, even though it's a little chain, each individual island is also pretty separated from the others from the perspective of a finch, right? Because once again, they're not great distance flyers. They're, you know, they fly around up into trees and they fly around whatever, but they have dinky little wings. They're not, you know, they're not like seagulls where they can just easily fly from one place to another. So even within that island chain, there's a certain amount of allopatric speciation. And then you add to that the fact that the islands are different as far as what types of resources they have. That leads to all of the natural selection that produces so many different species of Galapagos finches. And so some of these we've talked about before, like our little woodpecker finch. Look at him with his spine picking out a grub. And there's our ground finch that has the big old honk and beak so he can eat the big seeds when it's dry. And there's a little tree finch, it's kind of boring. And our cactus finch who likes to eat the cactus flowers and cactus fruits. We haven't talked about vampire finches before. They might be my favorite because what they eat is blood from stabbing other birds with their beak. Right?
Wait, so vampires are real?
Vampire finches are, and vampire bats are too, but not. They don't turn into humanoid things.
Well, yeah, but like the concept of a vampire,
sure,
real,
right?
Wait, why? Wait, how do they get their nutrition?
Blood.
Yeah, but
blood
is that enough?
Yeah, nutrient rich. I mean, a mosquito does just fine eating your blood, right?
I can't curse, but they're buttholes.
Exactly. Okay. So anyway, so yeah, so that's another example of allopatric speciation. Okay. All right. So I don't want to do a million different examples. There's another example of this. So this is an image from Freeman where they're saying, okay, we're looking at various different, sort of where the wetlands were and where rivers are in South America over, millions of years, right? And so this species of bird called the trumpeters, their ancestral population is primarily in this area. And then as the Andes like rise and as the Amazon River connects this wet area to the Atlantic Ocean, we start to have this separation in populations. And then as there's more and more branching, as that sort of is draining, right, as there's more and more branching and the Amazon River gets more and more, you know, kind of separated, it separates these guys because they don't fly. They are flightless birds, right? So we get these distinct populations. And in the case of these guys, there have been separated long enough, millions of years, right? That they accumulate differences that are significant enough that they're different species, even though you can see just in these two examples, they look pretty similar, but they're definitely distinct species. Okay, so that's allopatric. All right, here's another little cute example with a little bit of overlap, some different salamanders. Salamanders have much less ability to move from one place to another because they need to be moist. So they generally live in like damp leaf litter and, you know, places that have a lot of moisture. Sorry, my Roomba is very loud. And if you hear it, tell me to chase it. I like locked it out of my room, but it's trying to get in. Anyway, I named it Euphigenia. If you don't know the reference, you should look it up. Anyway, so salamanders are really limited. They can't like traverse over dry areas of land. So they're really very much, you know, impacted by even small geographic separation if they can't stay moist in their travels, right? So we've got this interesting group of species of salamanders that are closely related to each other, but they're all kind of in their own little separate area. And they're not necessarily so different that they're at the point of being different species, but they are different subspecies. Okay, so there's that. Is that okay? That makes sense.
How would you like tell if they're subspecies versus like different?
We're not even going to go there because we had a hard, so it's already confusing enough to try to decide what a species is, right? Between the biological species concept and then other concepts and then blah, 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 blah. In general, what constitutes a subspecies is based on sort of the determination of people who are experts on that organism, right? So if a salamander expert is like, you know, they're different, but they're not really different enough to be different species, I'm going to call them a subspecies. And the rest of us who don't know that much about salamanders are going to be like, okay, that sounds good to us. So it's kind of like a, you know, a professional judgment.
Okay, so you won't like test us on this, right? To like determine if it's
No, not subspecies. No. Okay. Right. So, and even for that matter, with species, I want you to know the biological, I want you to know what the biological species concept is and how it works. And that there are other species concepts, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I don't necessarily, that image that I gave you guys of all the different listed species concepts, I certainly don't want you to, that's just for fun. I don't want you to try to memorize all of that. Okay. All right. So if you've got this separation and then reconnection, right? Do we or do we not have speciation? Well, it depends on what happens, right? So you can have a fusion of our two populations, they freely interbreed, and then we would say, well, that wasn't really speciation, was it? Right? So they come together and they freely interbreed, and it's like, okay, so there was allopatric separation for a minute, but they didn't actually, you know, they didn't actually successfully become different species. Okay. Sometimes you have situations where there are hybrids or formation of like new species as related to hybridization, right? Or sometimes you have these two populations that separate, they become different species, and it turns out that one of them is a better competitor than the other. And it's like, okay, so that other one goes extinct. Right. So there are, the punchline of this little table here is just that it's not always super straightforward. There are weird things that happen. Okay. And so, you know, don't feel like you need to memorize these, but the punchline is this: allopatric separation does not automatically result in allopatric speciation. Okay, it can, but not always. And in order for it to result in speciation, there have to be an accumulation of genetic changes. Okay. Questions about that?
Looking at this diagram, could I ask what the difference is between hybrid zone formation and formation of new species?
So hybrid zone would imply that, so the little purple area, that these guys can breed with the red population or the blue population. They're hybrids of those two populations. They can breed with either. Whereas in this case, the difference here is that the hybrids sort of become their own distinct thing, and they can't, because the hybrids are unique enough, they can't go back and breed with either parent population.
Oh, okay. So it's like,
so it's legit that you're confused, right? Because they kind of look like they're the same thing, but the difference here is just, can you kind of breed back and forth? Is this stable? It might not be stable. It might just be like there's a hybrid zone for a period of time, but then there isn't. Or it could be like, oh no, these hybrids ultimately become their own dang thing.
So I don't know if this is a good example, but this is like when somebody makes a mule where like it can't, you know.
Well, but in the case of mules, they are completely sterile, like 99.99% of the time. So in that case, you can't even form a hybrid zone, let alone a new species, because they're sterile. So this would be the kind of thing that would only work in species that are able to hybridize, which only applies to, I'm going to be bold and say, a small number of animals. It's much more, hybridization is much more common in plants, right? But in animals, it's, you know, it's problematic. Okay. It can happen, but not as often. Okay. All right. Any other questions about any of the allopatric speciation? So another thing I want you guys to know is that there will be, when I post this video, there will be closed captioning. So you can turn on the closed captioning when you watch it. If you're like, she's not writing down very much, I'm having a hard time taking notes. You can turn on the closed captioning and like copy paste stuff, or, you know, whatever from there. Just so you know, right? So you can capture things. All right. Okay. Sympatric speciation. So somebody remind me, sympatric speciation is what's different?
Isn't sympatric speciation, doesn't that occur when there is no geological separation?
Right. So in this case, we still have the same steps 2 and 3. I'm going to scroll back. I don't want to make you barf, but I'm going to scroll back. So in this case, right, with our allopatric speciation, it was geographic isolation, then divergence, then genetic isolation in both of these. Okay. In sympatric speciation, steps 2 and 3 are the same, right? The only difference is that there is never any geographic separation. So there is something that happens that isolates some individuals from a population, but it is not a geographic isolation. It's something else that prevents gene flow. Okay, so pen, where's my pen? Here it is. Okay, so something blocks gene flow, but it's not physical separation. Right? That's kind of the punchline there. All right. As I've said before, I think this one is a little bit harder to wrap your brain around because it's just kind of like, it makes sense to me that if, this group is living in this habitat and this other group is living in this habitat, that they would eventually become different and, yada, yada, yada. So this one's a little bit harder to kind of think about. So, so here's an example from Freeman. There are other examples that I'm going to look at as well. If this one doesn't float your boat, we'll look at some other ones too. So this is a type of fruit fly, right? And in this fruit fly, a mutation occurs that changes preference for different scents, right? So one of these flies prefers the smell of apples. And so they fly towards rotten apple, rotting apples, ripe apples, right? And they mate and they lay their eggs, and their eggs, hatch in these apple trees and, make little grubs. And then those grubs metamorphose into adult flies. And so they're called apple flies because they like apple trees. Okay. Hawthorn is another type of fruit that we don't eat. You're not getting in the grocery store. So you probably haven't heard of it before. But it's another fruit that fruit flies like to use. Okay. So hawthorn flies are very similar to apple flies. They came from an original, same population, right? But they prefer that hawthorn scent. So even if they're living in exactly the same area, right, they separate themselves by their food preference, essentially, right? And what ends up happening is that even though they live in the same area, based on that genetic predisposition to prefer one scent over another, the populations are separated, right? And so they eventually become different species. Okay. So in that case, it's like a food preference that leads to sympatric speciation. Okay. One of my favorite examples of sympatric speciation is the primroses that were studied by Hugo de Vries. So that guy's name is Hugo de Vries. I don't care if you know his name, but he studied primroses in his garden, and he was really into like trying to get the plants to be like bigger and have bigger flowers and be prettier, and because that's what people who garden want, right? They want prettier plants. And so what he found in his garden is one time he's breeding this particular species of primroses. One of the offspring is like huge, right? So the plant is way bigger and has bigger flowers and is much fancier than the other ones. So much so that it's, significantly different. All right. And so what happened with Hugo's flowers is that there was a error in meiosis where we had a replication of chromosomes, but then they didn't split, right? So you may recall back in 40, I don't know if you guys learned this or how much you learn about it, but non-disjunction is where you have, a replication of chromosomes as if you're going to do mitosis or meiosis, but then they don't separate the way that they're supposed to. Does that sound familiar? Yes, give me a thumbs up if that sounds familiar. Somebody, at least. I don't like doing this on Zoom. I'd much rather be able to, you guys just kind of like nod at me and be like, yeah, we get it. Anyway, so in that case, in his case, what happened is it was basically a duplication of the entire genome. Elle's got her thumbs down. I don't know. Elle, is your thumb down because Zoom sucks, or is it because you don't remember non-disjunction?
All of the above.
Okay. So, right. So I'm not going to go into the whole thing because I'm not going to expect you to like regurgitate it all, but in a nutshell, essentially what happened with Hugo's primroses is one of the plants of this species of Lamarckiana, right, had this mitotic error where instead of reducing the diploid number of chromosomes down to the haploid number in meiosis, the gametes were diploid. And so when they joined up with other diploid gametes, what do you end up with?
A lot of extra stuff.
You end up with twice as many chromosomes, right? So I don't know what the normal chromosome number is for primroses, but we got double now. And what's really kind of interesting about plants is that it's fairly common in plants that when they have errors like that, it makes them bigger, right? So I remember when I first learned about this, I was like, what? I was like, extra chromosomes are generally pretty bad if you're an animal, right? So when you learned about non-disjunction, you may have learned about some of the different chromosomal abnormalities in humans, such as Down syndrome or other trisomies, where you end up with extra copies of just one chromosome can have all kinds of, impacts. Some of them lethal, right? Some trisomies are not compatible with life at all. Some of them cause, fairly minor problems in the grand scheme of things. But, typically they cause problems. Whereas in plants, evidently having a whole extra set of chromosomes is no big deal, right? So I'm not going to get into details of the difference of auto and allo polyploidy, but I do want to talk about what that term means. So poly, you guys remember what poly means, right?
Multiple?
Many, right?
Close
So
enough.
polyploid means that we end up with more ploid than normal. So instead of being haploid or diploid, right, we're talking like tetraploid or something, right? We're talking about an extra more chromosomes. Yeah. So autopolyploidy is just when that happens in yourself, right? So auto, right? Whereas allopolyploidy happens when there's some sort of mitotic error in one individual, and then another individual, there's fertilization that happens, and you get this like hybrid, and then it does a weird thing, and then now we have a different number of chromosomes, right, because of that. So I don't really care that you know the difference between auto and allo. My main concern is just that you know that polyploidy is the name that we use to describe that circumstance, right, where we end up with extra chromosomes. Okay, so polyploidy is a general sense means there was this is the part of my screen that doesn't work anymore because my poor computer's old. Mitotic error results in too many chromosomes. Yeah. Okay. So what does that mean for us, right? So if a plant is typically diploid, right, and then we have this organism that's tetraploid, it's going to be difficult for them to, because they have totally different numbers of chromosomes, it's going to be difficult for them to breed, right? And so conversely, right, if we have these two different plants that have diploid numbers of 6 and 4, the only way they can breed is if you have these errors, right? And those don't happen often, right? They're called errors for a reason, right? They're not typical. And so normally these two things would be separate species. And then if you end up with them breeding and they do have offspring that survive, now their diploid number is 10, so that's even weirder compared to those two, right? So do you see where I'm going? Okay, so polyploidy is one example of sympatric speciation where you have separation of individuals genetically that didn't have anything to do with geographic separation, right? In this case, it had to do with just some sort of error in mitosis, right? So a mitotic error is what is producing that that difference. Okay. And for all my carb lovers out there, right? We actually should all be very grateful for a series of polyploidy events that happened, because that's how we got wheat, right? So the ancestor to wheat is this grass that has these sad little dinky kernels, right? And so we can follow the genetics of wheat, of modern, the wheat that we use for bread and pasta and, all the things, right? We can follow that back and look. Thank you, Elle. Thanks for the bread. We can follow that back and look at the genes, right? Look at the chromosomes, right, of different groups of grasses, and see where hybridization had to occur to produce our modern bread. Okay, so notice that these sad little grasses, they don't have very many chromosomes. Two different species of grass, they don't have that many chromosomes, only 14, right? Now they're different species, but they do have the same number of chromosomes, so they it's not a big stretch for them to hybridize. But most of the time those hybrids would be sterile, unless of course there is some sort of error in cell division and you end up with self-fertilization, which essentially is duplicating. So that if we have, chromosomes A and B from this parent, and A and A from this, B and B from this, you get one of each, and then it duplicates. Now we have a total of 4 chromosomes, right? Where there were originally only 2. Yeah. So we've duplicated by combining chromosomes from 2 different species to make one new species. So our 14 chromosomes is now 28. And so that's called emmer wheat. And it turns out that emmer wheat has a little bit bigger kernels, right, than the 2 parents, because like I said back with Hugo, for whatever reason in plants, when we have these duplications of chromosomes, it often leads to things being bigger and better, right? So the little wheat seeds, wheat fruits, they're technically fruit, but whatever, right? The little grains of wheat are bigger, okay? And then there was another mistake that happened between a hybridization between emmer wheat and back to our wild guy, right? A different, well, not the same wild guy, a different wild guy, right? And we got, once again, got sterile hybrid. But if you have self-fertilization, right, you end up with this, right, which is modern wheat, the wheat that we use. Okay, and so it's not hard to imagine the circumstances that would encourage something like this to happen. Okay, so imagine that you are a farmer, thousands and thousands of years ago, and you know that this grass produces these little kernels that are nutritious, and so you're growing them in a little plot, and there's different kinds in there because you're just harvesting them and trying to grow them from nature, right? So there's it's a mixed field of different things, and then all of a sudden one of these plants gets formed where it's like, dang, that makes a lot more and a lot bigger kernels. That's going to be better for making my whatever, right? For making my bread. Okay. And so then you selectively breed that one, right? So you grow as many of those as you can in your field, but you're not super picky because, trying to scrape out a living, right? So you've got these other guys around there too, right? And then, a mistake happens and you end up with the, queen mother, right, of wheat. And it's like, oh yeah, no, that's good. We're going to selectively keep breeding that and forget all these other ones. Yeah. So, it's a combination of selective breeding, but selective breeding as a result of genetic accidents that is responsible for the wheat that we eat today. Okay. And so these are all examples of sympatric speciation, because while it is possible to occasionally produce hybrids, it's only as a result of genetic errors, right? And so the idea is this species is separated from this species the vast majority of the time, unless some sort of weird genetic error happens, right? But we still are pretty safe calling this a different species from that, because look, A, they just look different, and B, they're quite different genetically, right? Because we're talking about 14 chromosomes versus 42. That's significant. Okay, does that make sense? I see a thumbs up. Anybody else have any emojis for me? No. I don't even know if you guys are out there listening. That's okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
At step 3, how did the total chromosome count for the sterile hybrid end up at 21?
So 14 from this guy, right? Because we take 28 and we divide it in half. So we get 14 from this guy. And then from our 14, we divide it in half, we get 7. 14 plus 7 is 21.
Got it. Thank you.
Right. And then it doubles. Yeah. And then you end up with 42.
Awesome.
Yeah. I know it's hard to follow. Okay. But once again, like, I'm not going to expect you to like recreate this diagram or anything like that. The point is just simply that this is a good example of sympatric speciation, because you have these genetic errors that result in, new species, right? That don't have anything to do with geographic separation or any of that. Okay. All right. Any other questions about wheat or primroses? Maria wants to see the cat with the extra thumbs. I will, at the end of class, I will see if he is available for comment. He might not be. He is not a fan of being on Zoom. He's like, why are you grabbing me? What's happening? I'm not a freak for everyone's entertainment. I will see if he wants to visit. Okay, cool. All right. So I'm just gonna skip that slide because do I want to talk about this? Do I want to talk about it now? Yeah, I do. Okay. So I do want to talk about it now. Okay, so when we're talking about macroevolution, right? So we've talked about allopatric speciation. We've talked about, well, let me back up a step. We talk about what a species is and how, and right? So what is a species? Before we can even talk about how you get new species, we have to know what that is. Okay. We talked a little bit about the sort of like branching speciation, or just, continuous. Then we talked about different types of speciation. So allopatric, sympatric, a variety of those. Okay. Another sort of topic within macroevolution is something called adaptive radiation. And so we actually have already alluded to this. We started talking about it when, once again, back to our finches, because that's everybody's favorite. Finches, the Galapagos finches, are a classic example of something called adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is a result of new habitats being available that are different from one another. Okay. And so what you're supposed to be getting out, and so here's our, a fun variety of pictures of finches again. So what you're supposed to be getting out of this little diagram over here is, so here's the initial event of that mainland finch getting blown over, right? A small population of finches from Venezuela blew over to this island, right? And, they're living there or whatever. And then, oh, look, it's pretty windy someday. Okay. Several years later, I don't know, whatever, right? And some of these birds blow over there, right? Well, now we have birds that are here that are well adapted to living there, right? They blow to this new island. Well, the new island has different resources and different things, right? So they become different, right? And then they kind of spread. Yeah, because there's another weather event or something, right? And then it spread some more, right? So you end up with different types of finches on different places as new habitats open up. Okay, so pen. Wait, why are you being a jerk? There. So multiple, sorry. I can't, my screen is bad. Let's try this. Multiple speciation events as a result of new habitats becoming available. Okay. All right. This often follows, actually, pause that for a second. So here's a colonization event, right? So we move to a new location with new resources. So that's the Finch story, okay? Another cause of adaptive radiation, right, of this kind of explosion of, I shouldn't say speciations events, I should say speciation events. Another major cause of adaptive radiation is mass extinction, okay? So let's think about everybody's favorite mass extinction, the very large impact of an asteroid that hit the Yucatan Peninsula at the boundary between the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods that killed all the dinosaurs. Well, technically it didn't kill all the dinosaurs. It killed lots of dinosaurs. Okay. So there was a massive extinction happening then, right? For a variety of reasons, which we're not going to get into right now, but we will at some point, right? Tons and tons and tons of extinctions because it was like a nuclear level like event, right? I see your chicken, L, and that is very appropriate. So, right? So massive extinction event. So, okay. After that extinction, though, what we see if we look in the fossil record is we see this huge explosion of speciation, of new species developing, right? Well, why would that even happen? Well, once all the dinosaurs, not all, but many of the dinosaurs are out of the picture, now there's all these different resources that are available for other organisms, right? So I regularly like to say that you probably owe the fact that you are sitting in front of a computer right? And that we are, the dominant species on Earth to that asteroid. Because if that mass extinction of tons and tons and tons of reptiles had not occurred, there would not have been a huge radiation in mammals, right? So the only reason that we have after that extinction, right, have this huge radiation of mammals is because so many of the reptiles disappeared, right? So then I like to imagine, like, I wonder if super smart reptiles ever would have happened if, that extinction event hadn't occurred. And that's kind of like, I don't know, there's energetic problems with that, whatever, but you get my drift, okay? So mass extinction events often lead to lots of adaptive radiation, right? Colonization events like our finches lead to adaptive radiation, okay? And another thing is evolutionary innovations, right? So we're going to talk about that next. I need to yell at my dog. I'm going to mute so you don't have to hear it. I don't even know if you guys can hear her at all, but I can, and it's bothering me. Luna has been out of sorts since all of the environmental drama last night. She was not a fan of the thunder and lightning, especially when she could hear the thunder, but we couldn't hear it yet when it was far away. She was like, what's happening? The world's ending. We're all going to die. And you're just making me sit here. I can't. Anyway, okay. So let's talk about evolutionary innovations for a moment. Okay. So how fast does evolution happen? The way that you're like I don't know, the way that it's taught, I think a lot is as this sort of gradual change, right? That it's like, oh, well, it takes time for changes to occur and to accumulate. And so, you know, speciation is happening really slowly because it's this small sort of stepwise, you know, slow process, which is true in some cases. But it's also true that punctuated equilibrium is very common and quite visible in the fossil record, which we're going to have to talk about that after the exam, and that's fine, but we will. Punctuated equilibrium is clearly evident when we look at, you know, fossils and sort of the history of life, that it has been significant. Okay. And so what happens in punctuated equilibrium is instead of just kind of creeping along, right? You're having evolution by jerks, not people who are mean, right? But these like bursts. Okay. So everything's like the same, everything's the same, everything's the same. And then in a relatively short period of time, all of a sudden there's really rapid change. And then it goes back to sort of everything, hence the equilibrium, right? So it's periods of equilibrium punctuated by short periods of time with rapid change. Okay. That's what punctuated means, right? It's important to remember that when we're talking about both of these things, we are talking about the geologic time scale. So rapid still means like hundreds or thousands of generations. Excuse me. Right? It's not like today there's this and then tomorrow there's that, right? It very much, you know, is looking at the entire, you know, sort of all of geologic time, right? So relatively rapid being sort of the key word. So maybe not rapid from our perspective, but rapid based on the, you know, yeah, so cover hundreds or thousands of generations. Okay, so this could take tens of thousands of years in a primate or just a few months in bacteria, because remember, bacteria reproduce really, really quickly. Okay, so that's punctuated equilibrium, right? And so we do see evidence of both, but this is kind of a big thing, all right? And one of the ways that we see this is we see this with these evolutionary innovations, okay? So let's talk about some of these for a little bit. Now, those of you that have already taken 62, especially if you've taken it with me, I don't know if other instructors cover this quite the same way that I do, but you in 62 you learn about a little something called Hox genes, or homeotic genes or developmental genes, and those are genes that are responsible for development of organisms. Okay, and so these different big exciting innovations, right, all the examples that I'm giving you are results of big changes that are a result, so big like phenotypic changes as a result of fairly small genetic changes that just happen to be in really important genes. Okay, so the first example of this is exaptation. Okay, so in exaptation, what exaptation is it's when you have a trait that is used for a purpose, but then it essentially becomes like co-opted and is now used for a different purpose. Okay, a trait initially has, and I'm trying to be really careful of my teleology here, right? Because I'm not implying that any of this is by design, or at least I'm trying not to, right? But a trait has a particular function and then it gets used for a different function. Okay, trait has one function, then is used for a different function. Okay, So one really excellent example of that is feathers, right? So as it turns out, there was a whole group of feathered dinosaurs, many of which went extinct, right? So this is a fossil of a feathered dinosaur called Archaeopteryx. And it's very much an example of one of these like missing links where it has characteristics that seem very reptilian, but it also has characteristics that are somewhat bird-like, right? So it has very much the skeleton of a reptile, including teeth, right? Including having a long bony tail, right? Including, scales, right? And all of these reptilian characteristics, right? It has little fingers like a reptile, okay? But it has feathers. And so these feathers likely first evolved as insulation, right? And so there are a large number of dinosaurs that were endothermic. We're going to talk more about what all that means when we get to organismal ecology. So that's going to be coming up pretty soon, actually. So for now, I'm going to use the very poor terms warm and cold-blooded, because you probably learned it that way when you were a kid. Okay. But we'll talk about why those terms are bad later. All right. So most of the animals that we think of as reptiles now are cold-blooded, meaning that they're ectotherms, right? So they are whatever temperature their environment is. They do not control their body temperature by any kind of internal function, okay? Whereas a lot of the dinosaurs of this particular era, before the meteor came, were endotherms, right? So they maintained relatively high body temperatures using their metabolism. So they were warm-blooded. Well, if you're warm-blooded, one of the challenges that you have is it takes a lot of energy to keep yourself warm. And so any kind of characteristic that can help to, keep some heat in is a huge benefit, right? Because it saves you a lot of energy. So, and of course, now the gardener next door is like blowing. Anyway, okay, so
We can't hear it.
good. I'm glad you can't hear it. Okay, it's just going to distract me. That's fine. That's fine, because I'm not distractible anyway. So these feathers, right? The earliest feathers in the fossil record are very much like the downy fluff that you would find on like a duckling or like a chick, right? Like a baby bird, how it's like fuzzy and fluffy instead of like a flight feather. And so that's what feathers were originally like. And then over time, their use became sort of co-opted for a different function. So while they are still very useful for insulation, and if you've ever had any kind of pet bird or spent time looking at birds, when it's cold, you know that they like fluff up their feathers, and they, because what they're trying to do is trap air in there so that they warm up, right? It's like wearing your own, down jacket. There's a reason we use down, which is fluffy feathers in clothing. So it's still used for insulation, but feathers are also used for flight. And so here's our feathery dinosaur friend, right? Using these big, long, very aerodynamic feathers for jumping and gliding, right? And eventually, if you get real good at gliding, then, you can flap and kind of keep that gliding going a little bit further, right? You see where I'm going with this. And then ultimately, you got wings, right? So that's an exaptation, okay? Another fun exaptation is a totally different kind of wing, right? So how did insects get wings? Well, one of the things that we talk about in this class quite a bit is we talk about homologous structures and analogous structures. So we talk about structures that are not necessarily very similar in their function, but they're similar in their structure, right? They have the same sort of origin. So that's a homology, right? So the front limb of a human and a cat are homologous, even though cats use their front limb for running and climbing and grabbing and, whatever, right? Mostly for running and climbing. jumping. And we use ours for other things, for carrying things and writing and whatever. We don't walk on our hands very often. They still come from the same origins. They're homologous structures. Okay. So wings in insects and wings in birds are totally analogous, right? So they're used for the same function, right? Both of them are used for flight, but they're not made of the same structures, right? So whereas a bird wing is made of bone and muscle and skin and feathers, a insect wing is made of exoskeleton, like a flappy little bit of exoskeleton. So it's a totally different, fundamental origin. Okay. And so what's interesting about insects is, how do you end up with insects with wings, right? How would something like that happen? If from there not being any wings at all, how do you go from no wings to a wing that allows you to fly, right? That's not something that makes any sense, like incrementally, if you assume that the original function was always flight. Okay. Turns out that that's actually not what the structures that ultimately became wings were used for, right? So initially, insects had these tiny little nubs, and these little nubs, they would shake, right? They had muscles that would shake them, and the friction in those muscles work a lot like shivering, right? So you know how when you're cold you shiver, and what shivering is muscle contraction that generates friction, which generates heat. Okay. And so insects will do this. Insects are ectotherms, they're cold-blooded. And so insects, particularly when they're waking up in the morning and it's chilly outside, they can't fly around until they're warm. They can't be active until they're warm, right? So before wings existed in insects, groups of insects had these little nubbins that they would kind of like shake and use to, like, get their motors going, right? And then ultimately, warm up their bodies and go about their day. Okay. Well, those nubs gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger until at some point they started to have an aerodynamic benefit, right? So originally nothing useful in the flight department, just for thermoregulation. Yeah. But then once they reach a certain size, that aerodynamic benefit becomes a real thing. And so now wings are used for both of those things. So if you ever are outside and you see like a moth sitting next to a light, one of the things you sometimes see when it's cool out, right? So, we're getting to that season. You'll see the moths kind of like shake their wings, right? And the reason that they're shaking their wings is they want to go out flying, doing, moth things at night, but they're cold. So they got to warm themselves up. So and then they can use them to fly after they're warm, right? So that's another example of a exaptation. Okay. Right? Tons and tons and tons of exaptations. And actually, this is really good timing because I can't remember who it was, but one of you used eyes as an example in your teleology thing. And I was anyway, whoever that was, listen to this. Okay. Eyes are another interesting exaptation. The evolution of eyes is really kind of interesting and complex process. And so I'm not looking at mammalian eyes here. We are looking at eyes in mollusks in this example, but the evolution of eyes in mammals was kind of similar, right? So eyes didn't start as devices that can capture a detailed image, right? Eyes started as just some cells that were photosensitive, that were light sensitive, right? And so if you look at current, various different mollusks that are currently alive, you can see all the different types of eyes, right? So initially, those light sensitive cells were only used to just be able to determine, am I in a place where there's light on me, or am I in a place where I'm in the dark, right? What's the advantage of that for a limpet? A limpet is kind of like a snail, but not, and it lives in the water. What's the advantage of that, you think?
Able to detect light and dark would correlate to being able to see predators coming by, possibly.
Maybe, but probably more likely it's for just avoiding that entirely, right?
Yeah.
So if it's dark, that means I'm hidden under something, right? And so the predator can't see me. Yeah, if I'm in a dark place, whereas if I'm in a light place, that danger, right? Because there's light shining on me and, then you're more vulnerable. Okay. So initially it was, limpets can't see anything, right? All they can do is just detect, is it light or dark in their environment, right? That's all they can detect. If those light sensitive cells are in a cup shaped structure instead of a flat structure, now there's a certain directionality to it, right? So now it's a little bit more sophisticated in the sense that we're still not talking about producing an image, right? But if these cells on this side are triggered and these cells are not, right, you can know which direction the light is coming from, which helps you. So then you're not just like, just randomly moving until you find a dark spot, but you can move to an area that's dark by using the directionality because, right, they're in this cup shape. So that's a big advantage, right? So then if you've got this fluid filled cavity with your light sensitive cells, and there's like a little pinhole in there, now we're starting to generate something that looks more like an image, right? Where it's a more sophisticated sort of, you can make a pattern on those light sensitive cells, right? As the light is coming in through that small opening, like a primitive camera. Okay. And so now we're getting to something that looks like vision, right? And then, different species of mollusks have various degrees of sophistication in their eyes. With cephalopods, the squids and octopods and those guys having super sophisticated eyes that I would even argue are better than mammal eyes in a couple of different ways, right? So this is an example of exaptation too, because where initially it was just like, am I shaded or not, right? But not for vision, not for hunting, not for any of that kind of stuff. Just simply, is it light or dark here? Is sort of co-opted to be used for something that is really quite different, where it's now like creating a picture, right? Creating an actual image of what's around you, as opposed to just, is it dark here or not? Okay, so that's another exaptation. Mud skippers, and I just like this picture because it amuses me. So mud skippers are these fish that use their swim bladder. So swim bladders are normally, in most fish, used for buoyancy, right? When they're in the water, so that they don't sink. It helps them stay afloat without having to, use too much energy to stay buoyant in the water. Mud skippers are fish, but they are fish that can haul their butts out onto land for brief periods of time, because they use their swim bladder as essentially like a primitive lung, where something that was originally used for buoyancy is now used for gas exchange. Talk about a difference, right? So that's a very, big difference in what the function is of that particular structure. Lungfish do the same thing. So this is a lungfish, and they have weird little fins. They like crawl through the water. It's really bizarre. And they do the same thing. They live in places where the water quality doesn't have a lot of oxygen dissolved in it. So they actually will go up to the surface of the water and they'll gulp air and bring it into their swim bladder, to use it essentially like a lung, right? So total example of exaptation, something that was originally for buoyancy, but now it's being used for gas exchange, which is rad. Okay. And then this is everybody's favorite, because aren't axolotls cute? I know Maria likes them. Is something called pedomorphosis. And so pedomorphosis, you guys should be able to tell me what that means. So pedo, you should be thinking like pediatrician. What does that mean? Or pedophile. I mean, that's less charming.
Child,
Right. It means child
lover. Well, pedophile means child lover or child
No,
enthusiast.
pedo just means child.
Okay.
Okay. And then what does morph mean?
Change.
Does it?
I don't
Form.
know anymore.
It means form or shape.
God. God.
Oh, I'm sorry, Elle. I know, right? Means form. Cassie's like, no, I know this one. Right? So pedomorphosis literally means child shape or child shaping. Okay. So let me tell you a story about axolotls. a minute ago, about an hour ago, we were looking at salamanders, and we were talking about how salamanders live in wet places, moist places, but they live on land. They're air breathers, right? And the reason that they breathe air as adults is because while they are young in their larval stages, they have external gills that they use for gas exchange. But eventually, when they reach sexual maturity, when they become adults, they lose their gills and they develop lungs, right? That's true of the vast majority of amphibians, right? So frogs, salamanders, all of those guys, right? The way that toads, right? Their life cycle is they live in the water when they're young, and then they lose their gills, they develop lungs. There are other changes too, like, losing their tails in the case of frogs, whatever. And they become adults, and then they live primarily on land. But they're really not very good at regulating water because they, have very moist skin. So they are generally somewhat close to water all the time in their life. Okay. Axolotls are a really cool example of pedomorphosis because axolotls retain the juvenile feature of having gills, right, into adulthood. Okay. So essentially what happens with axolotls is, whereas most salamanders lose their gills at around the same time that they become sexually mature, axolotls don't ever lose their gills. They don't ever develop lungs. They just become adults without that change. Okay. So this is a pretty big change. Young forever. Yes. So this is a pretty big change, like functionally, as far as like where you're living, right? Axolotls can't breathe air, right? Because they don't have lungs. They still have gills, right? So they can't breathe air. So they can't climb out of the pond to go find a mate, right? But they reach sexual maturity and, have babies in the water. So this is an example of pedomorphosis, okay? And so typically what happens in pedomorphosis is there is some sort of genetic change. So a mutation, right? That allows childlike features to continue to exist in adults. I'm trying to pay attention to the time too. Oh, snap. Yeah, I can finish this in 30 seconds, right? Childlike features to exist in adults. So axolotls are a classic example of that, right? Humans, though, are another example of this, surprisingly enough. So let me just explain what you're looking at in this picture. So you're looking at the fetus, right? A skull of a fetus from a chimp and a human. And so if you look at these, you'll notice that in both a chimpanzee fetus and a human fetus, the skull is very round, right? All of the bones associated with the face are really, really small, and the brain case is ginormo relative to the face. Okay. So, as you all know, it is inappropriate to say that humans evolved from chimpanzees, because we did not. But it is appropriate to say that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor, right? So it is likely true that the common ancestor of chimps and humans had this same kind of super round head with a tiny face in their fetuses and young, right? But what happens in most primates, most apes, right? So chimps, gorillas, right? Is as that chimpanzee develops, the proportions of the skull change. So the brain case gets relatively smaller in comparison to the facial bones, right? So the facial bones are huge now compared to the brain case, right? This is a really significant and interesting difference, because this is the reason why chimps don't make good pets, because A, they're super smart, and it's not cool to do that to them anyway. But aside from that, look at how big their jaws are, and look at how big their teeth are, right? And they have these giant muscles, right? chimps they can be very violent, right? And they're amazing predators, right? Because they have these super powerful jaws with really sharp teeth, right? And so chimps, you know, are using their skull, right? Not just to house their brain, but also as a weapon, essentially. Okay. Well, one of the things that's really impactful in human evolution is that we our skulls don't change that much, right? So as we develop, our skulls, I mean, they change a little bit, but our skulls are much more of a childlike shape, right? Into adulthood compared to a chimp or other apes, right? So that we maintain this relatively large brain case in comparison to our facial bones, right? So what's the advantage of that? Why is that beneficial?
More space for a brain.
Right, bigger brain, bigger brain case, right? So more space for big brains. And so the trade-off there is, we're not as good at murdering things with our teeth. So there's a trade-off there, right? But we have these nice big brains that we can use to make like weapons so that we don't need to, yeah. Anyway, okay. So that'll be another example of pedomorphosis. So there's a genetic change that in the ancestors of humans, right, changed the way that their skulls developed. So instead of developing very, big changes between fetus and adulthood, that change doesn't really happen, right, in the same way, right? So as adults, we have child-shaped heads, right? Anyway, okay. So that would be another example of one of these, cool things. So pedomorphosis and exaptation collectively are kind of examples of evolutionary innovations, right? Where some small thing happens genetically that makes such a big difference that it's hugely beneficial, right? So whether it's, using a nubbin that ultimately becomes a wing, or whether it's, the shape of your skull being different, right? There's a small change genetically that produces a huge, huge advantage. Okay. All right. I think I'm going to stop sharing. So I'm going to say this, we're officially out of time. So I'm not going to talk about anything new, but if you don't have any other Zooms that you have to go to, this is now, you can ask about opportunity session number 1 if you like, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So don't feel obligated to stay for this if you've got other places to be, but I will record it so that I can post it. Bye, Elle. Elle's got to go.
Sorry, I just had a question from the outline.
Yeah.
This part for ecology section, it says, why isn't everything everywhere? Why do you, what does that mean?
So the reason I included that is because that is fundamentally the question that ecology asks, is why isn't everything everywhere, right? And so right now that's not super meaningful to you because we haven't started ecology yet. We have in lab, but we haven't in, in lecture. So for now, it's just it's a way of thinking about what ecology is, right? So ecology is how different organisms interact with each other, interact with their environment, right? And there's all kinds of different ways of studying that. But, the way that I kind of like to think about it is, why isn't everything everywhere? Why don't we have penguins around here? Right? What is that about? Right? That's an ecological question. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Anyway.
And then, sorry, there is for the definition of natural selection, the textbook kind of says it's a differential success and reproduction between individuals in a population. Can we say that, or do we have to say those with the traits best fitted for their environment get to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes? Which one is better to say?
I personally am of the opinion that the second is better. Because that's what I say. But it's not that the other statement isn't also accurate, but it's either's fine.
Okay.
As long as you really understand what the concept is, right? The way you say it isn't like, I don't ever want you guys, I shouldn't say that. I do want you guys to memorize definitions, but what's more important to me than memorizing a definition is knowing what it means, right? Being able to apply that concept, right? So what you say is less important to me as like your understanding of what those words mean. Because sometimes it's easy to memorize a definition, but not actually have any real understanding about what it even really means, right? And that's useless as far as I'm concerned. Okay. So as long as you've got a good grasp on like what it is and you can say it in your own words, that's really the best thing.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Anybody have anything else that they would like to talk about?
Hi, I had a question about the experimental ecology example.
Yes.
So I know you kind of briefly touched on it in class, but for that question or for that concept, do you just want us to explain the example?
So all I did was say that there's kind of like two areas of ecology, right? You can do natural history, which is basically just observations.
Okay.
Right. So you're just like learning what's out there, right? Or you can do experimental ecology, which uses the scientific method.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that was the punchline there, is just like, because I think that a lot of people think that ecology is all natural history, right? Is all just like, let's go outside and see who's out there, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just that, right? That is one part of it, but the other part of it is actually doing experimentation to answer questions. So.
Oh, okay, then I thought you wanted us to like talk about the examples that you touched on in class.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, you certainly could use those as an example, right? Of experimental ecology, but you could use we have been doing some experimental ecology, right? Where we're actually like asking questions and doing the scientific method to find out, are the pod sizes on, different Palo Verdes different or not, right? Are the different pod sizes equally frequent, I can talk, or not, right? Right. Okay. Are the leaf widths significantly different or the same in magnolia leaf? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Maria asked a question in the chat for allo polyploidy and polyploidy. Are they the same? I am not going to ask you to differentiate between auto polyploidy and allo polyploidy. I just want you to know what polyploidy is. So in a general sense. Polyploidy is when you have some sort of error in cell division that produces extra chromosomes, right? So chromosomes are failing to separate some way or another. Okay, but yeah, you do not need to be able to differentiate between allo and auto polyploidy. Is that okay, Maria? Is that good?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Anything else?
Yes, I actually have a question. Okay, so just to like clarify, because from like natural selection, based on the two observations, there were some interference, and that was unequal reproductive success, which is W1, right?
Say that last part again. So you have these two observations and then there's an inference, yeah?
Yes, but I just want to like clarification on what those two were.
The two observations.
Yeah.
So the two observations.
Like the interference.
So the two observations. The first observation is that and I'm paraphrasing. It's worded better in the PowerPoint that's in Canvas. So I'm paraphrasing, but essentially the two observations are that not everybody lives, right? So there's an overproduction of offspring for all species. Not everybody survives to adulthood. Okay, so overproduction is the first observation. The second observation is that individuals vary, right? So within any population of organisms, individuals vary from one another. They're different from one another. And a lot of that variation is inherited. Not always, but a lot of it is. So those are the two observations. And then from those two observations, we can infer that as a result of those two things, you would expect that there would be unequal reproductive success based on those variations, right? So if there's variation and not everybody lives, then maybe ones that are better suited to their environment are going to be the ones that survive and have more babies themselves, right? So the whole like two observations and an inference thing is just to frame it for you so that you realize that natural selection is based on, the concept of natural selection is based on observations that are not disputable, right? So we know that not everybody lives, right? We know, we can observe this a bazillion times, right? We know that individuals vary from one another genetically, right? And if those two things are true, then it kind of goes without saying that we would expect unequal reproductive success, you know, i.e. natural selection, right? The idea that individuals with certain traits are better suited for their environment at that time are going to be more successful in reproduction. They're going to have more fertile offspring than individuals who are not well suited for their environment. Did that help you, Senia?
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. I will also say, don't anybody say survival of the fittest as a definition for natural selection. Why not? Why don't I like that? What does fitness mean? How about that? Let's start there. What does Darwinian fitness mean?
The ability to have babies.
Say that again.
The ability for the individual to reproduce and have successful offspring.
So it's about how many babies you have, essentially, right? So fitness is on a scale, Darwinian fitness is on a scale from 0 to 1, and it's compared to other individuals in your population, right? And so 0 means you don't have any fertile offspring. 1 means compared to all of everybody else in the population, you have the most fertile offspring, right? And so it's a scale, but the idea is that fitness means that you've made a lot of babies, essentially, and will probably have a lot of grandbabies and so on and so forth, right? So the idea to say that survival of the fittest is a thing doesn't make any sense, because in order to be fit, in order to have fitness, you have to have survived, right? So when people say survival of the fittest, what it brings to mind is this idea of like, oh, the strongest and the fastest are the ones that are going to survive. And that's not always true, right? What makes you well suited for your environment totally depends on what kind of an organism you are and what things are like at any given time and in any given place, right? So survival of the fittest is just bad. It's bad. It's not, it doesn't really explain anything very well at all. Okay. All right. Anything else? My beautiful people. Thanks for coming to my Zoom. I will post this as soon as I can, but it's going to take a while because first Zoom has to like, you know, do whatever processing they have to do and make the transcript. And then I have to post it on YouTube, and then YouTube has to do its whatever thing. So it'll be up as soon as I can get it up, but don't expect it to be in the next half an hour, right? Because it takes, those processes take time. Okay. But as soon as it's available, I will link it in there, and I will put it in the module for what we're talking about right now. Okay. Right. And also probably just put a link to it directly in an announcement so that you can click on it really easily as well. All right. Any other questions?
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. I'm so sorry that we could not meet today. You know, it's a bummer, but I'm also dying to know what happened. Like, because there's not tragic flooding at my house. So like, what happened to the Rancho campus that they're like, nobody can come here?
When they sent out that email, I was like, it rained for like an hour.
Right. Right. I'm with you. But here's what I'm wondering. Do any of you guys live close to the Rancho campus?
I work at the Starbucks close to school, and it rained so bad it looked like a hurricane.
Right. But did you
Our
see like
tables-
any
our
after
tables
effects?
barely-
Were there like mudslides or things?
There was just a lot of water coming
Yeah,
down.
there's a lot of water.
Okay. Because it was real wet here too. Like the streets were rivers essentially. But after it stopped raining, it stopped. So I'm curious to see what kind of, what happened to campus. I hope nothing happened to the zoology lab or I'm going to cry, you guys. Okay. So just be prepared. Anyway. All right. Anything else? I know some of you are probably like, oh my God, there's been enough of her this morning.
Thank you so much, Professor.
You're so welcome. And seriously, guys, if you have other questions about anything, email me, come to office hours, whatever. I posted an announcement before the one about campus being closed today, saying what my office hours were going to be this week because they're a little bit different, which is actually good for you guys because it means I have office hours tomorrow, which I normally don't on Tuesday. So check that announcement too if you want to swing by office hours. Okay. All right. I'll see you guys on Wednesday where you will be ready to go. Okay. All right.
Thank you,
Bye.
Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.